I need more space on this table. Thank you all very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you for inviting me. And I know that Temple Micah is a wonderful place. I have friends who come here and encourage me to join them. My first question for you is, I'm very curious about your own experiences with searching out your own family histories. And I wish I could talk to every single one of you. Could any of you maybe tell me a word or two about your own quest for searching out your families, and whether you've gone to some of the countries where they've come from? Yes.
Stand up.
Stand up.
Mine wasn't, I didn't start out searching. Do I need a mic?
It's on the way.
I didn't start out searching. This is Peg Bleckman. But I came to services here one night, and I looked at the service sheet for the Oneg, and there was a Wendy Schumacher who was doing the Oneg with her aunt. And I went up to her and I said, "That's my mother's maiden name." And she said, "Well, we don't have any cousins here except Olga Crick." And I said, "Olga Crick is my cousin." It turns out, and then she sent me on an email a photo of a handwritten on a napkin family tree. And there was my grandfather's name and my grandmother's name. It turns out my grandfather had a brother in the Bronx that none of us ever heard of here in Washington, and she's from that branch of the family tree. So I've met her family and she's met mine.
Remarkable, wonderful. Yes.
Alan Carpian, a few years ago, we went to, Alan Carpian, a few years ago, as a matter of fact, it was 9 years ago, it was my dad's yard site was today. We came back around this time. The trip was to Prague, Budapest, Krakow, Warsaw. And since I was going to Poland, I decided my mother, her brother, her siblings were born in Kovel. And I said, well, gee, I'm trying to figure out how close is Kovel to Warsaw or Krakow. And I started looking it up. And then I called my uncle who was out in Los Angeles, and he told me a story how he took his Polish birth certificate. He was about 4 when he came over. Took his Polish birth certificate to the consul in LA and was told there's no such place in Poland. I found out Kovel, and there's a real story there about the Jews were rounded up, put in the great synagogue. They were destroyed there. And they were writing on the wall. I understand many of the wall writings are actually in Israel now. It's called a ruined garden. Kovel now is about 20 miles across the border in Ukraine. And it was pretty far from where I was. That's why the Poles were telling my uncle, sorry, my grandmother was born when it was under the Russians, before World War I. And apparently after World War II, they reconstituted Poland. And then, I don't know when, they moved Kovel back over the border into Ukraine. So that's mine.
That's fascinating, you know, and so often people say, well, I'm from Russia, you know, but, you know, Lithuania was called Russia in those days.
I'll carry the microphone when you recognize someone.
Okay, please.
I don't know that I need a mic. You do.
For us.
Take the light.
So, this close?
Your name?
I'm Janelle. You all know who I am. Hi. Thank you for having me. When I was much younger and more flexible, I went out to Vilna in Lithuania where my family is from and has been from pretty much until things got predictably awful. And I went to Vilna and Kovno, Kaunas, and just looked up everything I could find, and discovered that pretty much you either moved to Queens or were destroyed, which is not a great choice, but I'm glad that glad that the various why is it doing this to me?
Step back a little bit. Just to wait for the other mic.
Okay. So it was my privilege to follow my family's footsteps sort of in reverse and go see where we had been. And Vilna is a great medieval European city, and if anyone gets a chance, you should go. There aren't a heck of a lot of Jews, I don't know why.
And so Janelle is the descendant of Chaim Grada. I guess many of you know that, but that's an astonishing.
Not directly. There was a big fight.
There's always a big fight. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm Arthur Freeman. I put an ad in jewishgen.com or .org, I'm not sure what it is, but I put an ad in Jewish Gen and just said something like, anybody know a Tarshis family that lived in the Capital District of Albany, New York? And overnight, literally overnight, I got a response from Sweden. Turned out that a whole branch of my mother's family grew from the fact that one of her aunts married a guy who lived married a guy from Lithuania, but who took her to Sweden to live. And there's a whole big family that we did not know about. And my wife and I went to visit, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, and my cousin brought together all of the family. And together, we put together a family tree because they knew many more people than I did. And so now we've got a tree that takes up half the wall.
It's amazing. Wonderful. Anyone else? Yes. Here.
I am Phyllis Krosner. I have both sides of my family. I haven't come to visit any of them, but I was actually on an airplane in Norway and sat down next to a man, and he said he was from Baltimore. We started talking, and I found out that we had the same surname. The airlines had seated us together because we had the same surname. They thought we were traveling together. And he's a cousin. I had met his parents. He knew nothing about me. But through him, I started researching my father's side of the family. On my mother's side, there was a woman who has done a lot of research on the Jews from Ostropol in what is now the Ukraine. And I had written to her because she had some of my immediate family incorrect. And she said, there's someone who's looking for your family, and would you like to be in contact? And I said, sure. Got a phone call one Sunday morning from Israel, from a gentleman who had migrated there in 1967 after the 67 war to work for their foreign service from England. And he had started doing research on his great-grandfather's family. His great-grandfather and my great-grandfather were brothers in a family of 11 or 13, of which we've now identified almost all of them and tracked their families. And he's still working on it. So it's pretty cool.
Amazing. I'm going to go on, but I'll try to make sure there's time at the end, so if others want to share their stories. Well, it looks like we could write a whole book here. It's quite amazing. When I was a child, about 7 years old, I came home from school one day and I found my parents home. My father never came home during the workday. He was very conscientious. They were sitting on the steps between the first and second floor of the house, very troubled and holding a letter. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was serious. And that weekend, we came to Washington, where my grandmother's mother lived. Walby was her name. And the men in the family, uncles and cousins, were walking up and down the living room trying to solve a problem. Again, I didn't understand what it was, but years later, I put together a family gathering and a family history with one of my relatives, Donald Walpe, and in the course of that, I saw that letter again. The letter said something like, you live in, it was from Lithuania, it was from Jacob Walpe, you live in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, I live in Gehenna, in hell. We must meet you immediately, we must meet you. You must arrange to see us. By the time that letter reached us, it was 1941, the Germans had taken over Lithuania and done a good deal of the killing. And Jacob was in a concentration camp and was killed later on. And his son was killed as well. His daughters and his wife were in Stutthof concentration camp. The mother was killed, and the two daughters, at the end of the war, the Germans took the women from Stutthof to get rid of the evidence, put them in a ship where they weren't fed for 8 days, and then dumped them into the sea. And my cousin Masha and her sister Pearl swam towards shore, towards Kiel, Germany. The sister Pearl died before reaching shore, and my cousin Masha ended up lying in the surf at Kiel, and a British soldier kicked her thinking she was dead, and she moved, and he picked her up and took her to the hospital, and she survived. Her story is utterly amazing. She was in the resistance as a young teenager, and was in prison at a certain point as, again, a young girl, and was at one point saved by a priest when she was being followed. And when she was in prison, the other women said, "Don't cry, you'll be dead anyway." And she stood up and she said, "I'm going to be a teacher. I will not die. I will teach Hebrew to children," she said. And she taught Hebrew in the day school here when it first began. I think she was one of the first teachers, Masha Walpe Baris. And when she moved to Michigan, she also taught Hebrew. She taught for the rest of her life. She had a joke with me. During the time when the Jews were in the Kovna ghetto, she was made to go to the airport to build runways for the Luftwaffe. And one day she was told not to go to the airport. She had to cook for some German lieutenant. And she had been in a wealthy family and didn't know a lot about cooking. And she said to me, "Imagine that I could be killed because I didn't know how to pluck feathers," she said. You know? And so finally the German helped her to pluck the feathers, and she cooked the meal. Years later, when she was in Michigan, she'd call me and she'd say, "Myra," she said, come and have supper with me. We'll cook together. We'll pluck feathers." She was a tough cookie and wonderful. I wanted to share some words from my oldest granddaughter, Rachel Langosh. Rachel wanted to go to Lithuania with me when she was 19, which was a while ago. And I was very interested in her impressions of Lithuania. My impulse when I'm traveling in Lithuania and in other places is not to be in the large cities, but to walk through the villages. And Simon Schama wrote once that we learn history not only through the text, but through the archives of our feet. And I think I learned the most about Lithuania right after the Soviets left, by going there and walking from village to village with people who knew the languages. And by some miracle, we were taken into the homes of non-Jews and we were talked to, and people had not shared their feelings about what they'd experienced, where there'd been killings in over 200 villages of the Jews. And I will always be grateful to those people who opened their homes and their hearts to us. So Rachel went with me one year. She said, I was always fascinated with my grandmother's mysterious annual journeys to Vilnius, Lithuania, and her fascination with a community of people that none of my immediate family members knew much about. She would often come home with photographs and documents from her travels, as well as the history of our family. She collected narratives of living relatives who once knew Lithuania in the post-World War II years. It was the mysterious appeal of such a faraway place, a place that held so much historical information, through both the spoken accounts as well as landscape. This is what led to my own personal interest and decision to travel to Lithuania with her. It was Rachel's entry to Vilnius and her expectations of what she would find that were so dissonant with what she actually witnessed. To my surprise, she says, I found myself immersed within a cosmopolitan city, overwhelmed by numerous internet cafes, restaurants, and large storefront advertisements of Jennifer Lopez promoting her latest perfumes. My grandmother's stories often reflected intimate sharing of personal histories in small village homes. The world of modern elements seemed to hold no place for the memory of its past. Why had this culture transformed so abruptly and consciously to bury the horrors of the past? Where did the memories of Holocaust survivors and others affected by the drastic political and social changes of the past fit into this chic cosmopolitan present-day society? What are the cultural factors that led to the silencing of the memories of Lithuania's Jewish past? And more important, what present-day factors have allowed for the apparent emergence of Holocaust studies, primarily in Lithuania through literary, filmic, and other culturally collective elements in the past decade? And I know that when I was last there, which has been a couple of years, that over 92 schools were teaching the Holocaust by then. Although my great-grandmother left Lithuania before the start of World War II, many other members of our family were directly affected by the destruction and power inflicted upon the Lithuanians during the war. The second-generation survivors have a hard time in coping with their parents' Holocaust experiences. Many of the survivors avoid telling their offspring the horrors because they wish to spare them the mental anguish. I'm lately getting many emails from second-generation survivors whose parents have died. Now that they are gone, they realize they've missed the opportunity to speak to their parents about their experiences. Many of them are in real distress about it. This is Salius Verginis, she's quoting, who wrote Light One Candle, and when she was there, it turns out he was there giving seminars which she attended, and then she continued a correspondence with him. She concludes that if I'd merely traveled to Lithuania and stayed in the apartment in the bustling Sklarew street, filled with cafes and small shops, I may have never realized I was actually living in the former Jewish ghetto and walking on the cobblestones that my ancestors walked on only 60 years prior with Jewish armbands and sunset curfews. There was no evidence of this history to the naive visitor, which greatly disturbed me. It was only the re-memory of the streets of the old Lithuanian ghetto that I walked down with a Holocaust survivor who shared her memories with me, that the pictures of this history could take shape for myself. That survivor was an amazing woman named Yocheved Shartak Inchuriene, who believed that she had the right to live no matter what happened. She simply believed she had the right to live, and something like 20 people saved her life and made it possible for her to live. And I was grateful to have walked through Lithuania with her. The past social and political intentions to actively forget the Holocaust existences have triggered the urgent and vital responses from the Jewish Lithuanian community to document and preserve these same memories. And I would like to say, there isn't much time, and I want to talk about both rescuers and also by people of the next generation who have done things that I consider very important. One of them is someone named Rimantas Žirgulis, who it turned out lived in a town where 29 of my family are lying in a massacre pit, and where 2 people in my experience and in my life, in my family, did survive, who I got to know and did not know of their existence until recent years. And I luckily had 9 years with one of them, and we talked on the phone sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. He lived in Switzerland. And my uncle David Walpe, who in South Africa, who was a wonderful writer and wrote a book with Zutzkever, if you know the poet. And Rimantis is a non-Jew whose family was exiled to Siberia for 16 years. He took over the very important synagogue and Bet Midrash in Kadaini and turned it into a museum largely dedicated to the Jews of Kadaini, not only to what happened in the Holocaust, but the centuries where they lived, and where they contributed not only to Lithuanian Jewish culture, but to the world culture. And I should say that when I first went to Lithuania, which I did because I was invited to help start an artist community in Umbria, Italy, in a 15th century castle. That's another whole chapter, but, and I thought to myself, and that was in 1993, and the Soviets left in 91, the 45-year occupation by the Soviets in Lithuania. And at the time when the war started, there were only 2.5 million people in Lithuania altogether. It was a tiny country the size of West Virginia. The Jews made up 225,000 were Jewish people. And of those, something like 95% were killed, mostly right there in their villages. So I figured that Italy couldn't be too far from Lithuania, and so I bought a ticket, and I helped with the artist community, which is thriving, by the way, if you want to go be an artist. Civitella Ranieri in a 15th century castle in Umbria. So I wanted to take a train. I wanted to go slowly across Europe. I wanted to feel this coming to the home of my people. But I was told that I'd end up having to bribe a Belarusian guard and I would never get into Lithuania. So I flew into Vilnius. I knew nobody. The language I studied for a year, but at that time I didn't know any of it, and it's very difficult. It's Indo-European, but its closest relative is Sanskrit, if you can imagine that. So I get there, I start calling guides, mostly they're Russian, and they're not the least bit interested in my Jewish towns. I didn't know it at the time, but my family came from at least 15 towns that I know of, all around, mostly around Kovna. And so I hung up and I thought, well, here I am, I don't know a soul, and I don't know what to do now. And the phone rang, and it was a remarkable young woman named Regina Kobolevich. Regina called me, and to this day, we don't know how she knew that I was there. But she said, I'm interested in what you are. I'll be there at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. And she was there. And where does she take me first? But to Kadaini, to the town where my own family had lived, and that I didn't even know at the time. And she walked me around, and she got a survivor to walk with us, who was born there. His name was Udal Ronder. And Udal and I became fast friends until the day he died. I loved him dearly. And he walked me past every Jewish house, and he told me who lived there. He says, here's Moshe Leib Lilienblum. He founded the Haskalah movement, he said. And here's where the Vilna Gaon came when he was 6 years old. But the rabbis couldn't teach him anything. He already knew so much, you know. And it was just an amazing experience. And after that same day, she took me to Dottenva, a little teeny village, no place, you know. And as we were coming into the village, an elderly woman ran after the car crying. And so we invited her to come into the car. And we said, what is the problem? And she said, I thought you might be survivors coming back into Dottenva. And we talked a while, and then we went on to other things. And the next year when I came back, I said to Regina, I want to go visit her in her house. I want to go to Dotnova and see her. And we went there, and we're sitting there talking, and suddenly she stops talking, and she says, you look like Leah Lepajko. And I almost fell off my chair. That was my mother's first cousin. And my mother never met Leah Lepajko. She never left Lithuania. But at that moment, Alexandra Balandiena, the elderly woman, began to describe my entire Dotnova family, which included Jacob Walpe and Masha and so on. The whole, the joke was that it was made up mostly of Walpes, that was the town. And then I went back there every time I went there. I always went back there. I got to know her and her husband, and when he died, we offered her our sympathy, and I got to know her children and their grandchildren and so on. And when my granddaughter came, Rachel, Alexandra was dying. She was at the end of her life, but Rachel was there early enough to at least meet her and to see her, and to visit with the rest of the family. I will always be grateful to her. That's the thing about it, that in the villages you could meet people who really could help you understand what happened. And she told me that the priest in her church said not to worry your hearts, and the Jews killed Christ, and this is what happens to them. And I recognized the phrasing of that, what she said, what the priest said, and it was from the Gospel of John. When I was in college at Tufts, I went to a seminary to study Old and New Testament, and I remembered those words, which is, the house of the Lord has many rooms, do not worry your hearts, and so on and so forth. And she said, but I did worry my heart. She said, I never was content with that, she said. So that's part of the story. Let's see where else I wanted to go. I would say about all of that in my life it seems to me that the best things that happened were purely accidental. That on some level they weren't planned, and I didn't know what the next step should be. I wasn't a big planner about things, but it seems to me that sometimes working on hunches and trying things is powerful. I want to talk about some of the people who rescued others. And then I'd like to, let's see how our time is. In a place like Lithuania with the Germans, helping to rescue someone could cost you your life at any moment. And sometimes people were killed after the war by their neighbors for helping to rescue. So it was a very serious business. And the people I got to know and learned about, luckily to be there early enough to meet some of these people, were a real lesson, a life lesson. One who's very famous to people who look at this stuff is Ona Shemaita. Ona Shemaita not only saved people, but like Zutzkever and others, saved papers and documents and in remarkable ways. Whether through her persistence, her ability to play roles, to appear uninformed, to wait out her interrogators, to ignore her own fear, she was exceptional, and still she paid a high price. From this one life, we have much to learn. Though she was eventually arrested by the Gestapo in '44 and tortured, she never gave any information to her torturers. She was deported to Dachau and subsequently to the Leideland concentration camp in France, which was eventually liberated by the Allies. She saved children and adults, rescued valuable documents and manuscripts. After the war, she kept promises to those who did not survive, contacting their families with their last messages. She lived in near poverty for the remainder of her life. Abba Kovner, a wonderful poet, Hebrew poet, leader of the resistance in the Vilna ghetto, once said that if there are 10 righteous among the nations, Ona Shemaita is one of them. As of 2016, some 889 Lithuanians have been awarded the Yad Vashem Medal for the Righteous among the nations. Another person who fascinated me in the way of rescuing was a doctor named Petras Boblis. He was the head of the Lovshelis Children's Home in Viliopoli, which was the site of the Vilna ghetto. He was born in 1914 and killed in an airplane crash in 1974, but he was served as physician in Lovshelis orphan home. He risked his own and his family's lives to save Jewish children, along with other doctors and nurses. And I was lucky, I was there for a celebration of his life, and his daughter came, and some of the children he saved came, and that was incredibly powerful and moving. What in the history or nature of an individual might account for later acts of rescue and heroism? Here is a description of the first day of medical school for Dr. Boblis. Many of the students had come from villages and, wearing their best clothes, entered the classroom shyly, feeling intimidated. Suddenly in walked a short, slender young man who was wearing a colorful shirt but no coat, multicolored golfing slacks, rather worn sports shoes, and carrying a fishing rod. He confidently strode past the front desk and remarked in a voice full of irony, "Here we are, we're going to be colleagues." At first, the others thought he'd lost his way, but no, this was Petras Boblis. After the professor left the room, Boblis announced that he still had to do some fishing. He attracted the attention of others, always arriving on time, in good humor, ready with an amusing story. He took few notes but listened attentively and seemed to retain everything. During recess, he would entertain the others with Charlie Chaplin imitations. Later, under great pressure, he was compassionate and sensitive to others. Petitions from ghetto residents to accept children were never rejected. When the doorbell rang at night, the door was opened to reveal a living bundle. Some were infants, some 2 or 3-year-old toddlers, accompanied by baskets containing toys. One can imagine how tragic was the existence of parents living in the ghetto who sent forth their children in an unknown journey. Members of the Gestapo began to notice the increase in the number of orphans after Dr. Boblis began working at the children's home. They increased their visits, interrogations, and document checks. At one point, when the Gestapo had come to interrogate, a quick-thinking nurse prepared a roasted goose dinner with cognac and all the trimmings. By the time the dinner was finished, the Gestapo no longer needed to pursue their original purpose. The work was very dangerous, and Jewish male infants who'd been circumcised were in particular danger. Others did not speak Lithuanian as their primary language. They spoke Yiddish. Homes had to be found for them quickly. Boblis was usually the first to discern when a colleague was in distress and to offer help. Though the youngest of his colleagues, he excelled in his work. His nurse at Lovshelis told for years that respect and love for Dr. Boblis enabled her to bear the hardships of the work and to conquer fear when interrogated by the Gestapo. I was lucky to be there in time to meet those nurses. They were quite remarkable as well. He was posthumously awarded a Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem. So the question there for me and for all of us is, why was he willing to do that? Why was he willing to put himself in such danger? What about him made him different from others? It reminded me of the town in Les Chambon, France, where every single person in that town helped to save Jews. Another person who I interviewed at length was a man named Bronius Elioshaitis, and Bronius and his mother and father were major rescuers. And my friend Yocheved, who I mentioned earlier, was saved by Bronius and his mother. The mother sat her down when they first met and talked to her for several hours about what she had to do in order to survive, that she could not stay in any one place for more than one night at a time, number one. Bronius forged papers, and eventually she was able to leave Kovna and go out to the countryside to stay on the farm with someone until she was discovered by a shoemaker's wife, who then she had to hide again. But what struck me was both Yocheved's belief that she had the right to live, which is not necessarily a lifesaver, but it seemed to help, and the fact that it took so many people to keep a single person alive. And at a certain point, she was put in prison, or taken to prison, and she was beaten by one of the guards, and she got very angry. She said, "Why do you beat me?" And he said, "You want to run away from the ghetto?" And she said, "No, I have hunger. I want to eat. You give us no bread." And she told me that story with a great laugh. She said, then she's taken to another place with a different guard who is beaten with a belt. She runs around the room to get away from him. She spies a guard through the door who's laughing. "I was so angry," I said in German, "why do you laugh? I ran away from the ghetto 12 times. Once I was gone for several days in December. My grandfather was angry. You must not run away. All Jews must be together. It will come, the Messiah, on a white horse, and we'll all be free. He took away from me those things that would give me the ability to run away, my snowshoes, my coat. On December 20th, 1941, she left the Kovna ghetto and did not return. She stayed with various friends, and then learned that a brother of a friend lived outside on a farm outside of Kaunas, and she went there. And in January, in the middle of the night, in a hay wagon. Well, I could go on talking about those who helped and those who were saved. But let me go to another place. I'd like to just say a word or two about Rimantis and the museum. Rimantis, as I mentioned, took over the synagogue in the town of Kadaini and made it essentially a Jewish museum, though not only, but largely, and not only, as I said before, about killing, but about preserving the incredible contributions of the Jewish people of Lithuania. I always asked him, well, why didn't you make a museum for your family who were exiled to Siberia for 16 years? Why did you choose the Jews? So here's what he writes. So in my family are 4 generations of deportees who were sent to Siberia. My father, with my grandfather, grandmother, and my uncle were deported to Isles of Trofimovsk and Bobrovsk in the delta of the Lena River in the far north. They spent 16 years there and lost 1 child, the father of my father who died of disease. But very few Lithuanians were thinking about the fate of their Jewish neighbors who could not exit from the mass graves. I am an historian. I feel as a citizen of Kadaini my duty to talk about our history and contemporary problems. So for me, it is very important to commemorate the whole community for our citizens who lived here about 300 years. And probably the main lesson for Lithuanians should be to finish dividing the society into we and they, which is why I'm going to write all names and family names in Lithuanian. And what he did in recent years was to hire an artist, and the artist built a steel wall at the massacre site, and on the steel wall are engraved all the names in Lithuanian, not in Yiddish and not in Hebrew, of all those 2,076 people who are lying in that massacre pit. And it's a very beautiful wall. You can see through the letters. And so on Holocaust Memorial Day, I and others go there and help them to honor and remember the Jewish people who were killed there. So again, his purpose was not just to provide a memorial, but to honor the work of the Jewish community for centuries before in the town of Kadaimi. I think that's all I'll say about Vivantis. One other person I'd like to briefly mention is a man named Salius Verginis. Salius, again, is a non-Jew who is a very important filmmaker, and his major subject is the Jewish community of Lithuania. And he's provided incredibly important films for the Holocaust Museum here and for archives all over the world. And films, he's interviewed the killers, collaborators, somehow gotten people to talk who normally wouldn't, and has gone and has done it. I mean, it's dangerous to do that. It's still dangerous to do that now. And I've been lucky. I was able to travel along with him during some of his filming searches, including a trip to the remaining wooden synagogues all over the country, which are amazing. And a lot of things that were there when I first went are gone now. A wooden cheder in Kadaimi and so on. Why don't I ask you if you have questions? Let me just see if there's anything else. One thing I focused on in this book that I've written is about the persistence of trauma and the reasons for it. But I don't think we have time for that. So do we put some time?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Can
Don't stop. Sure.
we? Okay. Well, why don't let me take a couple of questions as we go along. So.
Okay. As the official mic wrangler, I just wanted to ask you, as we get started here, you have drawn upon what seems to be a very rich knowledge acquired through an amazing journey of your own. You're speaking from notes here. Are you working with the Holocaust Museum, or are you publishing? Have you published? Where can we turn to learn more about what you have learned?
I have a book coming out probably next September, which I call A Survivor Named Trauma, Holocaust Memory in Lithuania. It's the first time I've ever really tried to write a book like that. I've written books of poetry and essays and things, but so that's where SUNY Press is publishing it. And if there's time, I'd like to read one section of a long poem I wrote about Lithuania shortly after, during some of my earliest trips there. But, and I brought some books to give away, by the way. One is the book about Lithuania, the poetry book, and another one's a book we just did about aging. I thought, it's an invitation to a country called Aging. I know nobody here is interested in that. Yeah.
I'm good.
Oh, sorry.
I'll work the room for you.
Thank you.
You yourself asked the question about why people who were rescuers became rescuers. And I wondered if you came to any conclusions. I'm sure I'm not alone in wondering what I would have done under those circumstances. So do you have any understanding of why people, not people as in the village of La Chambon who were religiously motivated, but ordinary people, why did they risk everything to save others?
I haven't understood that exactly, but I'll just say this, that Salius Verginis, I always ask them, why would you do that? In fact, when I interviewed Bronius Eliashaitis, who saved my friend Yocheved, after a couple of hours, I apologized. I said, I must be making you uncomfortable. I'm so sorry. He said, I was interviewed, I was questioned by the Gestapo. Do you think you can make me afraid? But there, his mother, he and his mother were both in prison for some of the things when he was young. But Salius Verginis, the filmmaker, told me that his grandfather had some work to do with the postal service, and that he was knowledgeable about everybody in their town. And Salius used to go out with him on some of his work errands. So Salius was kind of introduced to the larger world early, and I think that, and I must say that Lithuania, though it looks very civilized, and I probably shouldn't say this, but you have to be careful. To this day, you have to be careful about what you say and what you don't say. There's still a lot of anger. When my book went out for review, which is routine, I got an 8-page review from a Lithuanian scholar that was so angry and so hateful, really, and it was very important to me to see that, to know that that still is alive in that country.
But angry at whom?
At me. For what I'd written in my book, that it was, I haven't looked at it lately, but that it was out of date, that it was more than that I had misread history, et cetera, and I'm not a historian, I never pretended to be, but I'm careful about facts when I'm writing a book. But it just taught me that, so that when I see people like Salius Verginis focusing entirely his work on the Jewish history and on the Jewish murders and so on and so forth. To interview the people who did the killing, to get them to talk later in their lives, that is dangerous and amazing. And he gives that material to the Holocaust Museum here. We have now evidence of some way to understand why these things happen. Other questions?
Let's give our names so the speaker can know.
My name happens to be Bruce Sklarew, not at present the husband of Myra. Okay.
Do you expect to be?
You never know. I just said, if I were a psychoanalyst, I would, without any first-hand experience with people who help cause other people to survive, I would think of some of the work of Anna Freud, who, in her own right, it's a statement, but in her own right, is probably the second most important analyst of all time. And in her work on defense mechanisms in particular, she has a section on altruism, in which she surmises, maybe incorrectly, that the only pure altruism is a mother's love for their child, and it's a very complicated phenomenon. But one dynamic would be to, away from the purist, to identify with a potential victim and wanting to be saved from, not necessarily slaughter, but saved from some guilt or some worry about what could happen to myself. That would be a research to look at this.
there was a hand here, Mary.
Yeah,
He's coming.
Mary Schwartz.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
Miriam, yeah.
Oh. Mary. Oh, and then Chin, okay. Mary. I was wondering, Myra, if you talked to people who felt some guilt that they did not rescue, and I mean both other Jews and Gentiles, and what the curse for Lithuania was for that country, with people who wondered why they didn't do more. I mean, one question is who gets to who are the rescuers, but another question is why wasn't I a rescuer? And when you asked the question, or Barbara said that when we have all asked ourselves, what would we have done? The answers are sometimes difficult.
Particularly there, because there were so few, I mean, you're talking about a tiny population, so out of 2.5 million, you got 250,000 who were Jewish, right? So, and the killing was done in the towns themselves by the white armbanders who were Lithuanians, and others who were forced by the Germans to dig the pits, and although most of the pits were dug by the victims themselves. I have talked to people who were concerned about that, and Mrs. Balandiana in the town of Gotneva talked about that at length, about wanting to be of help. But I don't know, I didn't really get an answer to that and why. But I'm sure the fact, I mean, Lithuanians will argue with me about this, but the fact that the people who experienced the Holocaust and then under the Soviets for 45 years couldn't really communicate with their children and with the next generation. So there's a kind of silence in the country, which is another issue, so that they didn't, now there's a problem, because now the second generation afterwards, or third, are asking questions. And it turned out that in Lithuania there's a Yiddish program that for 2 months a summer teaches Yiddish, which Miriam knows well about. And who are the students? Some of them are like Miriam and are teaching here, and some are like young German women and men, who come there to learn Yiddish, right? So what is that? What does that mean? Why do they come to Lithuania to learn Yiddish? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about David Katz and that whole phenomenon of Yiddish. I taught there in the summer of 2008, and Louis and I had a lot of conversations, and I have no personal family connections with Lithuania, so I had none of that nostalgia. My family all came from Galicia and Hungary, and I went there to teach Yiddish not knowing what to expect. And I taught levels 1 and 2, so the most basic levels. And I had the honor of getting to know Fania, the librarian who took us on all these tours, and it was an amazing experience. But back then, I did not like Lithuania. I did not like Vilna. I came away thinking, thank God I didn't have to come from there. Hardscrabble place with infertile soil and long winters, and a very tormented history of being caught in between nations and empires. King Gediminas, who had been forced to convert to Christianity by the Crusaders, who were a bunch of thugs at the end of the Crusades, converted all his people to Christianity, and then was murdered by the Crusaders anyway. I mean, it has such a history. My students were great. I had 14 students from 11 different countries, all learning Yiddish for different reasons. And that was a wonderful, wonderful experience. But I felt then there was a mixed reaction. You had the only Jews, most of the Jews that were there were ex-Russians, who were sort of more ethnically Russian than anything else. And they were part of that Jewish community there. But the locals, I had a sense that there was a wish to sort of bury it all and that make it like go away because it was rather unpleasant and we didn't like being reminded of that. And now I'm wondering if in this resurgence of right-wing fascism in Europe, whether Lithuania is having that. So if you know about that, I'd be interested.
It's a very important question, and I don't know the answer. I haven't been able to go back for 4 years, but as soon as I can, I will again. But I don't know that. That's important. Be a good question for some of the people I've mentioned, like Salius and others, who would talk honestly about that. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Please.
Robert Season one. As someone who's tried a number of Lithuanians who were members of the Schutzmannschaft. First of all, you have to understand, that you understand, I'm sure, that Russia invaded Lithuania initially. Prior to the Germans coming in, the Russians treated the Lithuanians very poorly. They didn't have much to eat. When the Germans came in, many of them thought they were in heaven. They got uniforms, they got food, and formed the Schutzmannschaft. So it wasn't really the Germans that were doing most of the killing. The people that I tried the most, well, one anyway, was a commander of the detachment in the Kovno ghetto. And I became friendly with his son. The case was Jonas Stelmokas, who was a guard commander at Kovno, and Abe Malnick was the witness that I had, as well as another witness who was a survivor of the Kovno ghetto. And his son took upon himself, Abe was very involved with bringing clothing and other things to Lithuania to give to the Jewish community. And his son took that on after Abe passed away. And one of the things he wanted to do was restore the Jewish cemetery in Kovno, because the stones were turned over. The Lithuanian government gave him such a hard time, and he was working through the State Department. I used to say to him, you know, forget about it, because the State Department isn't going to do anything for you, and the Lithuanian government isn't going to do anything for you. I don't know what the status of the Jewish cemetery in Kovno is now, but I do know that there's a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism still in Lithuania, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah, Abe Malnick was amazing. I mean, he came long before anybody else and was really making a difference. I found a wonderful way to help, and you know, we're always looking for ways to be of help, and I figured out that the Jewish community, the survivor community of Kovno, had one doctor looking after everybody, and they were very short of medical supplies. And I found in those years that the doctors around here had all this stuff that they weren't using, and I went and got medicines and surgical supplies and all kinds of things. And once a month, I'd take my grandkids to the drugstore, and they'd pick out, you know, soap and toothbrushes and things like that, and we'd make up a big bundle and mail it to the doctor in Kovno. It was simple and easy to do, and for some reason, nobody stopped me. I don't know why exactly, but I love what Abe did. That he, long before anybody was making any claims or help, he just did it. Yeah.
I'm an interloper here anyhow, but I just, a couple of times, Chabon-sur-Loing, the French town has been mentioned, and I just wanted to, as a point of information, the movie that you can see on YouTube, which will lift your spirits, is called Weapons of the Spirit. And Weapons of the Spirit will tell you, made by Pierre Savage, will tell you a whole lot about Chabon-sur-Loing in the Auvergne region of France and how they saved the Jews.
He was so amazing. What was the father, what is his name?
Weapons of the Spirit.
No, the name of the.
Pierre Savage.
No, the man,
Oh, the father, the pastor.
Yeah.
I forget his name.
I forget his name. But when he was taken off to prison, his associates took toilet paper and wrote the verses of the Bible and so that he would have those.
When this is over and you have recovered from your experience here, if you could send us a short email of some of the citations that you know, not a big work, but 3 or 4, I think it would be wonderful so people can go into more depth at their leisure. Thank you.
Hi, Diana Season Wine, and this didn't happen in Lithuania, but Helen Epstein, who has written 3 books about children of Holocaust survivors, and her latest one is called Love and the Long Half-Life of Trauma. And it goes into how, despite her mother's having told her a lot, so much was repressed. Her first book was about children of adult survivors, and people didn't talk about it, just as you said. And then the second book was again about her mother, where she came from. And she's a wonderful writer.
She is, thank you. Yes. There's someone here.
Hi, my name is Roz Timberg. The Jewish Studies Center has had a series on conflicting memories in Eastern Europe, which is very different from Western Europe in terms of their story of the Holocaust and responsibility. But tonight will be a session. You probably have heard that Rabbi Hertzfeld of Ohev Shalom led a group trip to Ukraine this summer. Some of it was to go to different sites, but some of it was to meet with leaders and work on restoring cemeteries that have been needed. He's going to give a session tonight at Addis Israel at 8:15. The practical politics of historical memory. What can we do to protect Jewish burial sites in Eastern Europe? So I'll leave some of these catalogs out here.
Thank you. Great. I think maybe we'll respond.
One more.
Muriel Wolf here. Robert Season Wine referred to the issue of the anti-Semitism in the Ukraine, and I would like you to expand on that because it's obvious that it seems to be a problem, and how we're going to handle that. And the anti-Semitism of the Ukrainians, who obviously are not Jewish, as opposed to whatever Jews are still around. Lithuanians, I'm sorry.
I think that's another whole, I don't think I can. I think that one of the bravest people I didn't mention is Rachel Castani, and Rachel was the first person to start a Holocaust museum in Vilna, in a little wooden greenhouse. And the people who come through the greenhouse are mostly not Jewish. They're the people from other countries. The other one is Chiyu Sugihara, the Japanese consul, whose house in Kovna is also a museum, which my friend Simis Davidovich ran. To me, education is the answer, and to inform the younger generations who often don't know very much about this. think that's another big subject, yeah. I'd like to end with just reading a portion of a poem. When I first went to Lithuania, I didn't know really how to internalize what I was experiencing. And since poetry's been my way of life since I was 8 years old, when I had a teacher who often cried and discovered that her brothers were in the Second World War, and she would go to the window and cry. And I found that if I wrote little poems and stories about ants hiding under mushrooms like little umbrellas, and I could cheer her up. And the power of writing, I learned that from Helen Lang. But it turned out that I needed to do something more, which is why I wrote the big book about this. So this is just a poem, Lithuania, and this is section 8. And it's about, I also have gone to villages in Greece. I speak Greek, and my husband and I and our children lived with a Greek family in Boston for a couple of years, and I became attuned to those people. And in Greece, when the Nazis came in to the town of, it'll come to me in 10 minutes, but into a certain town in central Greece, they put all the women and children in a church and set fire to it, and they took all the men and shot them. And the women somehow got out of the church. And Charlotte Delbo, who was in the French Resistance, wrote about this in her book. And I just wanted to share these 2 pages. What I remember is not how they were rounded up like animals, caught like fish in a net, beaten and shouted at, dragged over the fallen bodies of their kind, not how they stood against a wall or at the edge of a ravine or pit or trench they themselves were forced to dig, knowing it was for their own graves, nor not how they were bludgeoned or blasted out of this life, nor what they thought or felt as they breathed in the air of their last moments, but what happened afterward, the single human acts that came afterwards. We know about the killings, we've seen the pictures, read the descriptions, heard the testimonies. We know nothing about the killings. How could we? But what happened afterward? How the women who were not burned alive in the schoolhouse or the church or their villages sent the smallest children home and walked up to the edge of the ravine to see for themselves. How they stepped carefully among the bodies until they found their own brothers, sons, fathers. How they tenderly held their hands, their heads still warm. How they did not know what to do. How they removed the wedding rings from the finger before they grew stiff and wore from that day on 2 rings on the wedding finger. How at night they came with candles and kept a vigil so their dear ones would not be alone all night. How in the morning they came with water and cloths and washed their dead and prepared them for burial. How they carried each of them on a pallet to the graveyard, 1,300 of them. How the other villagers came to help them, and they set them in the center of the cemetery. And with the stones of the stony fields, they built a wall around them to keep them from wild animals, to give them the burial every dead one deserves. But for mine, the tender acts afterwards were not possible, not the hands on their faces, nor the white cloths to wash them, nor a few drops of water, nor their faces turned upward to the opening sky, but thrown down, eyes wide against the blood earth, in whatever state they happened to fall, whatever moment of surprise or pain. Nor were there any to find them, to carry them, to console my dead, afterward to cover their actions. Those barely alive were forced to dig up the bodies out of the pits, the ravines, to prepare a place for burning, a stack of logs, a row of bodies, logs, bodies, orderly, but for the power of the odor of death, but for the decay of death, the fires taking them, taking the living, not even washing the dead, not even burying our dead, not even not. Thank you all very much.
That's lovely. Look at that. Robin. Thank you for your very moving and beautiful
Thank you very much. Thank you.
presentation.
Thank you.
Now to a little bit of the mundane. please do not clear. We have a couple of announcements to make. The first is that next month, on December 12th, we will hear Stacy Cloyd